I think it's really critical, the discussion that we're talking about here. And it has to do all with our land. And as our elders have always said, that the land is the center of our life as people, it's the center of our language, our culture, our history. So we need to take it very seriously. And we've always been in a struggle with government, both Canadian and British Columbia, and before that, Great Britain, regarding our land. And this is just a map showing the areas of Canada where there are cede, surrender, and release agreement treaties. And it shows like British Columbia being an area where there is no cede, surrender, and release instruments. And so the discussion we're having now is, what do we do with that large area, that white area there? And that's our territory, you know. It's BC Indigenous Territories, you know, and we know that. That's always been the center of our discussion. And we need to figure out what we're going to do, especially in view of the province, because the province is the primary competitor in terms of jurisdiction and use of land, not in terms of ownership. We own the land. It's in terms of jurisdiction that we're talking about under the Constitution. And you know this from your experience with the British, with the Constitution Express, that originally the Constitution was divided between just federal and provincial jurisdiction over our land. And they say they have mutual exclusive power over the land, which means 100% power over all our territories. And either all decisions regarding our land is either made in Victoria or made in Ottawa, and they don't recognize us. And that's a violation, a fundamental violation of our human rights as Indigenous people to self-determination. So in 1980, when Trudeau and Chrétien wanted to patriate the Constitution, you remember that the Union of BC Indian Chiefs engaged in the Constitution Express in 1980. They went across Canada. It's probably the most powerful Indigenous demonstration ever held in the history of Canada, because it actually changed the Canadian Constitution. And this is my schematic here about Section 35. And it just basically says that the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples, with an S, of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. And it's created an area, like this part here is the provincial government, you know, Section 92, and the federal government, Section 91, and Section 35(1) is us. The government doesn't look at it that way. The government doesn't consider that full of rights. But you know that you have hunting and fishing rights are under there. You don't need to ask the province for a hunting permit, and you don't have to ask the federal government for a fishing license. You also have self-government, and the Supreme Court in Delgamuukw recognized Aboriginal title, and so you know those are your rights. This doesn't give us our rights. This just forces the federal and provincial government to recognize our rights. Your rights come from your ancestors. It comes from the Delgamuukw people 200-300 years, 400, 500 years ago. And the government really doesn't like this arrangement. And that's what our parents always mean when their grandparents meant, when they said this land belongs to us. They meant that that's how it was to be shaped. And that's what you guys got right now. There's no and ifs and buts about it. That's like the province is negotiating with you to begin with. There's no darn way a white guy would negotiate with you over the ownership of the land if he didn't own it. You know, he just wouldn't do it. People said Delgamuukw only means that you need to go back to court. I disagree with that, because Haida said no. There's pre-proof remedies where you don't need to go back to court. We don't even know the full dimension of what Aboriginal title means in terms of economics, in terms of political and social and cultural aspects of it. Those things we're responsible for defining. But anyways, the way the courts of the country's been operating with Aboriginal title is they say that you only can get it recognized on the ground if you go through negotiations or you go through the courts. It's the only way that you can define it. And negotiations with them on principles have always been very expensive. Like this is taken from the BC Treaty Commission report 2008. This is the last report. They've literally loaned 50 First Nations $345.6 million to negotiate. And they haven't come up with any agreements except for Tawasin and Manuel. But we owe this money. And they said that the money was going to be repayable with or without treaties in 12 years, which would have put it 2006. But then they got an extension for another 5 years in 2011. The year after the 2010 Olympics, all that money is going to be owed, and they're going to have to pay it back at 4.26% interest, because I know that because the people from Fountain got a letter from Al Price from Indian Affairs where that's the price over 5 years, you know. So that's the guys we're dealing with on the other side. So I'm a little bit skeptical about it, because if they're going to do something, they should forgive that. For one thing, for those people that actually got themselves into serious trouble over there. But anyways, this is where I kind of draw some kind of comparisons here between the principles that are in the proposed legislation and also the BC treaty process. One thing I'd like to read right here is this part here where it says, the Act is not intended to affect the status of existing provincial Crown granted interest or tenures in land and resources, including fee simple title. In the treaty negotiations, it means that there will be no compensation. I put no compensation there because I'm just making a note that that's what that basically means. And what it means is that the province does not want to pay for all past infringements. And our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents went through hell because of the unilateral infringement on our lands. And they have destroyed the dignity of our people. Alcoholism and all these other things that were a consequence of that kind of thing. And the government doesn't want to deal with that. But the thing is that you need to remember that compensation is your biggest tool. It's just like if you owe money to Visa. You don't like answering the phone. These guys owe us. We're a big Visa for them. And that's how come they don't want to deal with it. Because that's your power, is compensation. And all the hardship that our people have suffered from. It says that nothing in this Act alters or can be interpreted to alter either negatively or positively the federal and provincial division of powers or jurisdiction of either the province of British Columbia or any Indigenous nation under the Constitution of Canada. What this basically does is it endorses this concept that they call concurrent model, where they say, okay, you Indian people can make certain laws in regard to your traditional Aboriginal rights, but they're going to be subordinate to the federal and provincial jurisdiction. And you need to be really careful of that. And these are principles that are seen in the BC treaty process. And I'd like to just quickly look at the Nisga'a Agreement, because the Nisga'a Agreement is the basic agreement that is the official policy of the federal government regarding Aboriginal title. If you negotiate, you get stuck with what these guys have did, and that's the way it is. And under the Nisga'a Agreement, you'll see the same kind of wording here in terms of the release section, where they say that the Nisga'a Nation releases Canada, British Columbia, and all other persons from all claims, demands, actions, or proceedings of whatever kind, and whether known or unknown. And in the second part, actually, the wording is pretty well identical in terms of the Nisga'a. It says, this agreement does not alter the Constitution of Canada, including the distribution of powers between Canada and British Columbia. That's how they get around not recognizing your rights.